listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How's it going?
Not so bad. Yourself?
I'm doing well. I was thinking back. We were having some good conversation with our guest today. I won't reveal who that is, but we're having some good old school, like how'd you get into hacking and stuff like that. It made me remember an old thing that used to run through my head, which is I need a Command Z, an edit undo feature for my life. So if you swing around and you knock over your coffee on your carpet, just Command Z, undo.
And, but then you would never learn anything. It would just be, let me fix that. I get the concept, but, I think mistakes are part of life.
Wow. I never
deep,
considered
right?
that. Yeah, that is deep, dude.
Thanks for tuning into philosophy with Jim and Jeff.
That would be one of those things. We should put that out as a survey question. Would you rather have an edit undo for life, or would you rather be able to learn from your mistakes? I bet you the edit undo would win. Yeah,
I think it was an Adam Sandler movie, right? Wasn't it like a remote control or something like that, where you could kind of control life or whatever it may be? I think it sounds cool, but I think about the practical aspects of it. I would much rather have copy paste, right? Give me $1, and then just here we go, we're done. We could solve all the world's problems with that.
That'd be another nice feature.
Yeah, no kidding. So we're going to get into our topic and our guest today. But before we do that, do we have any other news or notes that we want to bring up, Jim?
Yeah. So, LinkedIn is my favorite social media channel. And I guess I'm linked in with a lot of folks from the IDSA, the Identity Defined Security Alliance. Their website is idsalliance.org. And I've just been finding a ton of great blogs and a lot of great information. And I noticed they have they're advertising a webinar called Identity Matters: Applying an Identity-Centric Security Strategy in Healthcare, May 6th, 12 noon Eastern Time of this year, 2021. So if you get a chance, get out there. May 6th, 12 noon Eastern. They're having a webinar on applying an identity-centric security strategy in healthcare.
Seems pretty fitting, seeing as how we're called Identity at the Center. I think we would probably support that, right? And
yeah,
obviously IDSA does a lot of good work, so support those guys.
They definitely do.
So we'll put a link to that in the show notes so people can check it out. But why don't we get into our main topic for today, which is a very deep philosophical discussion. Maybe that's where we start off with, and talking about the semantic web and ABAC, or attribute-based access control. I'd like to introduce Evan Gertis. He's a penetration tester with NetFoundry, and also from the very, very small world that we live in, also in Augusta, Georgia, along with Jim. So you never know who's going to be in your backyard. Welcome to the show, Evan.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jim. Thank you guys for having me on the show. I'm really excited to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. And, as this is your first appearance with us, our initial question is always, how did you get into the space of information security and identity and access management? And, is it something that you chose, or did you choose it?
I've been giving that question some thought here, actually. And for people who have watched the movie Avatar, there's this point where Jake Sully goes up to this banshee, and he's told that the banshee will choose you. You don't get to choose it. And in so many ways, that was how my career in information security got started. As a young kid, I was playing Command & Conquer. My favorite Command & Conquer game was Command & Conquer Red Alert 2, Yuri's Revenge. I loved the cutscenes in that game. I lived for it. I lived for the bad acting. It was wonderful. I really enjoyed playing the multiplayer part of that game. So you could set up Russia and South Korea and stuff. And there's always a finite amount of money, and that was frustrating as a young kid, because I wanted to be able to buy all of the factories, all the stuff. So I started going through the files, and I found that there was an INI file in there, and I didn't know what it was, but I recognized the dollar amount for the starting amount for any of these multiplayer games. So I changed that, and I restarted the game, and I realized I could actually just make money. I could just make money by changing this file. that happened to be something that I brought up in a job interview out of college. So it definitely is one of those experiences that shaped me. It'll never go away. I'll always think about it. I think that was the first taste, and then from there on out, it just started to take on a life of its own.
I love the Red Alert story because that was something that we played too when we were younger, and let me tell you, it caused quite the ruckus. So it was something that our house was always involved with, and I would just say that yes, that was. I'll leave it there because I want to protect some of the people that were maybe part of things that probably shouldn't have happened as part of those games. So now you're working with NetFoundry as a pen tester. Can you tell me a little bit about NetFoundry and what do they do? I know that they have some play in the zero trust space, but maybe you can kind of educate our audience at a very high level as to what NetFoundry does.
Yeah, for sure. I wholeheartedly believe that we are the best zero trust networking as a service platform that's out there right now. So you can download one of our clients and spin up a ZD client essentially, and you can connect to cloud resources. To go into all the details, I don't really think we want to do that, but basically once you build a network, you can add services to that network, and once you have a client installed on your computer, you're able to access it. It's really cool. We're working on cutting edge here. We're really trying to make our product more accessible for IoT. But yeah, that's basically NetFoundry in a nutshell. We're a zero trust networking as a service platform. Just download a client and you can connect to your services in the cloud.
Very cool. So how does your pen testing background and role help serve that furtherance of security in the zero trust world?
Right. That's a great question. So as a penetration tester for a startup, you're going to have a lot of different roles, and you definitely can't be scared of responsibility. So when my manager comes to me and says, hey, we got to crack down on application static code analysis. How are we going to do this? We got to think outside of the box. So I introduced automation tools. I've introduced code scanning tools, and then I do manual penetration testing. A lot of the classic tools. One of my favorites is Burp Suite. If you don't have Burp Suite, if you are a penetration tester, bug bunny hunter, whatever, Burp Suite is where it's at. A lot of those tools are in there. It's pretty great.
So Evan, in kind of researching your background for the podcast today, I noticed that you have a website, so feel free to pump that. But just reading through it, I got the sense that you think very deeply about things. You want to be an educator. You want to, at some point, you talked about wanting to teach at a community college. I think that's great, having that desire to share information. And we talked earlier, kind of preparing for the show, you talked a lot about the semantic web, kind of web 3.0. So as much as you can, kind of bring that down for the rest of us to understand kind of, the evolution from, web 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and what the semantic web means for us.
Well, Jim, I'll first say I'm humbled that you think I'm a deep thinker. A lot of the stuff on my website, it's I have like quotes from different philosophers and whatnot, but those are people who inspired me. I can't take credit for their thoughts, but I do love sharing that, and I appreciate that you think that I think deeply. That makes me feel good. I don't know if I do, but I guess to start with the semantic web, this is going to kind of go back to my education. So I got my degree in physics. I studied at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I got my degree in physics there. I was around a lot of physicists, and I was introduced to the concept of networking while I was working at a nuclear lab there. So I had to make a stepper motor control, and I started to kind of get into networking, and I learned about Tim Berners-Lee, which everyone knows is the founder of the internet. He is a physicist, has quite a claim in all of this. And I started to read more about his biography, his background, and if anyone's interested, I think looking up some of his ideas in Wikipedia, which is a wonderful resource for anyone who's trying to learn more about the semantic web. There's a lot of documentation out there. I don't want to make this into a really complicated topic. The semantic web basically just is saying that at some point the internet is going to become machines talking to machines, and they'll handle our everyday transactions. So it won't be user generated content. Right now we're kind of in this Web 2.0 phase where people are uploading content. So I guess a hypothetical scenario that we could look at for the semantic web is imagine a machine that makes video content and then serves that to another machine, and then people just watch that, right? So is that possible? That's kind of what the semantic web is. That's really far out there. Does that answer your question?
It's an interesting example. I'm wondering with Web 3.0, the semantic web, I kind of think of the Internet of Things, and of course what the implications are with that from a security and from a privacy perspective. But I'd even like to back it up to Web 2.0, because we had a discussion earlier, and you mentioned Wikipedia as kind of user-generated content, and I was bringing up the kind of societal good and bad discussion. So, my perspective, having teenagers a lot, is they're locked into their phones and they're doing TikTok or Snapchat, and they're just, it feels like it's hard to kind of influence them in the same way that my parents influenced me, because they're so locked into all these influencers that are coming through to them in these other social media platforms. So Jeff, I thought, brought up a great point, though, with Wikipedia. So, Jeff, if you want to kind of jump in and state your case on behalf of the good of user-generated content.
Yes, I was thinking about it from an optimist perspective is, there's certainly downsides when it comes to social media, and I think a lot of this is more individual, right? You can have a great experience with anything on the web, and you can have a terrible experience with anything on the web. It really does boil down to the personal touch that's being influenced there. But I think of the greater good of things like Wikipedia, where, this used to be Encyclopedia Britannicas, right? You'd go out and say, oh, I have, this version from this year, and your data was only as good as that year. And now you've got all the information of the world at your fingertips. It is curated by volunteers all around the world. Of course, there are times when someone will go in and update a Wikipedia. My favorite examples are when someone in the sports world completely dominates another team, and somebody updates, and Tom Brady completely owns, whatever team is out there, right? And, it lives in there as a version for a certain amount of time, usually not very long. And then it self-corrects or self-heals because you have, this group of people who are through, nothing other than just making sure information's right and accurate, are making those updates. So I think of something like that as kind of being a great usage, great uses of it, and really kind of contributing user content, right? There's YouTube, there's podcasts like this, right? We're contributing content out there. We hope that it's correct. A lot of times what we're talking about is maybe opinion or our own experiences. So how do you validate something like that where, well, this is what I've experienced, this is what Jim's experienced, this is what Evan has experienced. There's always going to be some disconnect around that, but I see the good and the bad of it. I don't have kids, so I don't necessarily have to worry about necessarily the influence of influencers doing stupid things on the internet, which in my mind, that's always taken place. There's always been knuckleheads. Now it's just that there's a platform for anybody to put out their whatever they're putting out into the world. It's just a lot easier to consume, and that's I guess that's my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, well, that's a great wrap. Evan, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to say on that topic.
I think Jeff made some really good points there. I've noticed that there's the ability to decide whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, right? We can look at something and we can say objectively, this is good or this is bad, and that comes from within us. So I think you made a really good point there, Jeff. But it's just my personal take. I can't speak for everyone. I really agree with you, and I also can definitely see where you're coming from, Jim, that there are negative impacts from social media, right? Like there really are knuckleheads out there, and if we're not proactive in setting an example ourselves, we're gonna run into problems with people kind of just creating this negative influence. We definitely don't want that, right?
Yeah, one thing I think that's been great about the Web 2.0 and kind of the evolution of the web is the evolution of standards and security protocols like OpenID Connect, OAuth 2, even SAML. I'm wondering, Evan, kind of, can you talk about, with Web 3.0 kind of evolving, it's kind of here today, right? I mean, we're really talking about Internet of Things and continuing to evolve. Does that security model serve us well, or do you see gaps in the future where we need something more?
I think you brought up a really good point. Now, when we're talking about SAML and OpenID Connect and these authentication methods, are you talking about these use cases in the context of federation?
Right. Well, there are some human flows within those protocols, and especially SAML. But I think especially in OAuth 2, where you can, there are some machine to machine flows. I mean, does that really become the standard we build on going forward? For years to come, to support this Internet of Things, or do you even have a perspective on that?
That's a really deep question. I have thoughts on that, and I'll keep it as simple as possible. Right? We have Sally and Jeff, who work in finance. And in traditional role-based access control, Sally and Jeff have least privilege access to finance resources. Now, if we extend that to machine, let's say Sally and Jeff are now machines. So these are finance machines, and they're in the cloud. The way that I see attribute-based access control being applied here, and we're already saying that this is semantic web because they're machines. The way that I see attribute-based access control being applied here is they're tagged with finance, and they talk to resources that have that tag finance, right? So this concept of tagging things and then setting the least privilege access on the tag is the way that these things are going to talk to each other. That's kind of my idea. So if we could imagine that there's a Sally and Jeff machine with the tag finance, and then they're talking to a bucket, or they're talking to another instance that has that tag finance, then that would be attribute-based access control.
So when it comes to this idea of tagging people, and well, I guess not people, right? Now we're talking about machines. How do we set it up so that this is secure in the real world? We have a whole bunch of data around things and people. And when you're trying to connect systems at the machine level, usually the machine is expecting data in a certain format, right? It needs to be parsed a certain way. There may not be language interpretation methods that are trying to decipher just a text field, right, that may not be formatted a certain way. How do we approach that from a process of being able to enable this from a more semantic web approach where you have machines talking to machines, they're going to expect certain things? Is it an API? Is it a standard? Is it both? Is it still to be determined? Where do you see that heading?
That's an awesome question. I really think it is still to be determined. I think that there's a huge opportunity for this. I think we're just starting to see the starting stages of this. Actually, at NetFoundry, we ran into this issue when we were trying to design something that allowed a bunch of endpoints to talk to services, and we noticed very quickly that trying to do this with traditional role-based access control, we ran into problems where it wasn't scalable, right? So many machines, so many services. How do you scale it? And then that's kind of where we started to fall into attribute-based access control, tagging a set of clients, and then tagging a set of services, and saying, if they have the same tag, then they can talk to each other. That is actually being done with an API.
So when it comes to ABAC and attribute-based access control and RBAC, role-based access control, I guess from a development standpoint, how does this look from a machine perspective? When do you use one or the other, and where does it make sense? Where ABAC is a scenario where you want to use that primarily maybe as the method to drive authentications or authorization, whatever it may be, that data, versus the RBAC side of things.
I think like so many things, this comes down to cost, and return on investment. So if it makes sense to work with something newer like attribute-based access control, that's going to cost more money. But I really do believe in my heart that setting up the proper security controls in the beginning will lead to saving money in the long run. I do believe that that's how that works. I think that comes to an evaluation from management. They need to make the decision on whether role-based access control is going to be scalable enough for them to use. And also, there might be a limitation. There might not even be ABAC. That might not even be an option. So using AWS does that. You can actually use attribute. You can use ABAC in AWS. I think that's a great place to start. If certain people use AWS, I think that if they do want to learn more about this, that would probably be the place to start. We use it at NetFoundry as well. So, if you are looking to connect cloud resources to clients, you can definitely check out what we have. But AWS documentation on it is very solid. I would say looking through that and then figuring out whether it's going to be worth that return on investment. Yeah, in my opinion, if you got 10 people connecting to resources, okay, cool. Role-based access control, no problem. Are you designing an education system that's going to have thousands of students connecting to tons of educational resources? All right, ABAC might be the way to go.
You almost, it's kind of what I was thinking is I see ABAC being more policy driven, right? So you can kind of automate based on some of these attributes, and it doesn't make sense to automate something for 10 people, right? Unless it's the right 10 people, right? Or maybe there's some sort of, a compliance thing that needs to be associated with it. So I kind of see RBAC and roles being a precursor to the ABAC side of things, meaning you really don't have a lot of automation driving decisions that say, because I am Jeff and I am in the Chicago area, this is what I get, or this is what I can do. If you have a system where you need to do that and you have that data available and it's able to be interpreted by other machines or things, bots, whatever it may be, then I think it makes a lot more sense. Otherwise, yeah, you get into this position where you have role-based access control, and Jim, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but every company that we talk to is like, oh yeah, we want to go to RBAC, and then when they realize how hard it is and how much work they need to do to even get to that state, it becomes very difficult to even get to that area and to do it effectively, because RBAC is not something that you can let really die on the vine, especially if you want to live in the world of principle of least privilege. You have to be constantly recertifying roles, right? As accesses come and go, how do these things make sense? If you're driving it from an attribute perspective and you have automation that's picking up on those different attributes, you can probably get away with, being more granular from an access perspective, because you're relying on a machine somewhere to interpret that and say, okay, Jeff's no longer in Chicago. He has decided that he's going to retire to Denmark or something like that. So now my access changes because of a result of that attribute change, right? Other things might not have changed, but it could be that thing. Jim, from your perspective, does that make sense when we're talking about where the leverage between ABAC and RBAC kind of fits, or do you see it differently?
I think the RBAC approach is very, very centrally driven, very centrally manually intensive, in that somebody has to be going in and creating and pruning and like you said, recertifying roles. Whereas the attribute-based approach is kind of more or less a one-time setup where you're passing attributes to the application. I think in either case, the application is either determining from a role or from an attribute what access you have to the applications. But there is that extra step, from a central perspective in developing roles. I think that most organizations don't need only one or the other, that a combination of the two, especially in large organizations, can work very well, where you're using roles where you get a lot of leverage from it, and you're using an attribute-based approach where either you want to provide more autonomy to the application teams, or you just don't have the commitment from the business to manage roles in a holistic way. Because the thing is, if you develop roles and then you don't manage them, they can actually become more of a hindrance than they provide value, right? Because at that point, you think they're providing you security when actually they're not being managed. People are staying in roles they shouldn't be in. Um, the owners of the roles aren't clear, things like that, and you wind up, you'd be better off without roles.
I think you bring up a good part. There is no one size fits all. I think the best approach is you have a blend of what works for you, right? It may be that you have some attributes, and maybe you have some roles, maybe you have some both, maybe you shade one or another, right? This is something that also can change as the organization changes. You may decide that, yeah, you do have the opportunity to be more data driven in some areas, and others where you decide, no, we want to have this a little bit more tightly controlled and go through a specific, process or workflow, whatever that might end up being, because it maybe doesn't make sense to put the full power of an attribute policy or something associated with that. Evan, when it comes to how you see that working in the real world, do you have any idea, any experience as far as what you've seen from your perspective and how you've seen organizations tackle that?
I actually really want to go back to something that you brought up, because you brought up your observation about industry really being reluctant to embrace this attribute based access control. Where do you think this fear is coming from?
Good question. I'm not sure. I think it's my perspective is that it's probably based on immaturity from a IAM capability standpoint within an organization. I think a lot of organizations, frankly, struggle with doing good, proper identity management. They might have some, custom processes or tools, or they've got a bunch of IAM heroes in the background that are kind of making everything work, but it's not really managed. I think that's probably in the real world where most people would struggle is, yeah, we'd love to be automated. We would love to have policy based. We would love to have, all this other kind of tools and technologies out there. But in the real world, funding isn't, infinite. So there's choices that have to be made typically from an IT perspective of where you want to put the spend. Resources aren't infinite. So you have to figure out who's going to be able to work on this type of stuff. So I see it more as not necessarily, I guess, the industry side of it. It's more of the business. And the industry is a reflection of the business, meaning what are the capabilities and services that are ready to be consumed. And that's why sometimes you'll see like a great technology comes out and it's ahead of its time because business just wasn't ready to pick it up. Almost I kind of feel that's where maybe, blockchain might be from an identity perspective for an enterprise, right? Certainly there's use cases out there for, obviously cryptocurrency, and now we've got non-fungible tokens, and things like that.
Right.
But I still haven't seen an enterprise inside the firewall use case for that yet. I'm sure it's going to come at some point. I don't know when, what, or what it looks like, for now. But I think that's where the reflection comes in. Is I think it's more of realization of the business typically just isn't ready for it. Or at least most businesses aren't.
How about you, Jim? Like, what are your thoughts on where this fear from industry is coming from?
I think it comes down to control. I think even with ABAC. So what I made the case of earlier is that RBAC requires a lot more central management than ABAC. But even ABAC is kind of a centralization strategy, right? You're pulling these attributes into a central authorization store, and then when somebody authenticates to the application, you're passing the attributes to the application. They're being interpreted and security is being applied. The traditional model is that each application has a user management interface, and that through that user management interface, I apply, authorizations, whether it's attributes, roles, groups, however you want to call it. And so for applications to kind of give that up to a central store, there's got to be something in it for them. There's all kinds of dynamics that can happen within an organization of why people don't want to give up control. A lot of times it's fiefdoms. A lot of times it's, the central team has had some failures in the past, or, you just can't do it as good as we can do it. And so in my experience, that's what I found the most is that it's a matter of control.
Yeah, really awesome thoughts on that. I think that you both brought up really good points. It's something I've been thinking about, trying to understand this. I think you made a really good point, Jeff, when you said that we have like this ideal image of what identity access management is supposed to look like. And then we get into the thick of it and it's like, okay, wow, this we have so many problems here. What is the first fire we're going to put out? And you know, going back to what you were saying, the first question that you had asked me is like, when do you use role-based access control? When do you use attribute-based access control? I guess my hope is that ABAC will help remedy that whole problem of managing so many different roles. I guess that's kind of what I'm hoping. Yeah, I say that because day to day doing that, day to day managing that, it takes up a lot of time. And like you said, there are finite resources. It's not infinite. We have to make decisions, right?
We've been talking about semantic web. What's next? What comes after the semantic web? Are we all just Neo in the Matrix at that point?
Yeah, I think that's when we get to Deus Ex Machina, right? Like, isn't that
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. So what comes after the semantic web? That's such a deep question. I think I'll take your perspective here. I would hope that after the semantic web, people are going to have more education available, that they're going to be able to teach themselves things more quickly, that we'll have little systems that we can keep with us that will help us extend our memory rather than just constantly entertain ourselves. I do feel like a phone in so many ways helps us. It helps us extend ourselves. It's an extension of our thinking. I'm so grateful for being able to open up my phone and say, "Hey, I got this question. What's the answer to this?" I pop up my phone. I can't even imagine what was someone thinking in the 1800s when they had to solve a problem.
This is your teacher back in math school saying, you're not going to have a calculator all the time. Guess what?
We do. I know, right? We do. And I think after the semantic web, we'll have like a sort of indexing machine. And I remember my 6th grade technology teacher always said, Evan, the purpose of technology is to make life easier. So I'm hoping that my humble ambition is that after semantic web, life is going to get easier. We're going to have machines talking to machines, and it's going to be something that's going to benefit people. I really can't imagine, though. I really can't imagine what's going to happen.
I think is interesting is think of this scenario, the self-driving cars and the kind of intelligent mapping. I'm not sure what that's called, where or social maps, where it's like, hey, there's a traffic accident up ahead and it calculates the route, but that the cars are also having to take up what's going on around them, and all that data has to go to some kind of central store, be processed, and then distributed back out, and decisions have to be made. I think what becomes wild is that the technology, in order to support all that, I think still needs to exponentially grow the processing power, the network bandwidth, the ability to store all that data. It's intense.
Yeah, and this is going to go back to what Jeff was saying with attribute-based access control. The amount of management, the amount of tinkering that has to go into that. If we can think about the scenario that you just described, a potential car accident, and that's being communicated to a rescue machine, we got to make sure that's secure.
Yeah, one other thing that comes to mind is, so we're putting together at the company that Jeff and I work for, we're putting together an IoT steering committee with a large group of us coming from the IAM side of things, because so much about IoT comes down to security, right? It comes down to, and the thing was, when we were originally talking about it, we were doing this kind of vendor analysis of what IAM vendors play in the IoT space, and a lot of the focus was on authentication. But I think one of the things that came out in our conversation is it's more than just authentication. It's also not only authorization, but it's also registration. How do you register the device? I mean, those are the use cases that started to make IAM so complex. Even when you're talking about human beings, it's not just single sign-on. It's how do you get access in the first place, and then how do you make sure that the access remains appropriate over time. So really interesting. I think we'll wind up revisiting this topic on the podcast in the future as things evolve, and as this IoT steering committee spawns new ideas for Jeff and I think we'll continue to bring them to the podcast as topics to discuss.
Yeah, we may not have all the answers, right? But at least we know what questions to ask, or at least start to think about to have the conversations. Which sometimes that's the answer itself. Is, hey, we haven't really thought about this before. What are we going to do about it, right? And you can start kind of thinking about what's next. I see natural language processing as sort of the next field of how do we get to that Star Trek future where, I can tell a computer, exactly what I want in my own natural, language and voice commands instead of having to remember, hey, so-and-so to prompt, something to pick up on your voice and then speaking a very specific set of commands. And I see that as kind of the next level of ABAC is being able to have that translation layer now where you're saying, okay, I've got these different attributes, these different machines are talking to each other. How do I then translate that data back into something that a human will naturally be able to articulate and say, here's what I'm trying to do. And then the hard part, right, is how do you then make the computer understand, oh, that means XYZ in XYZ order for only XYZ person. And I think that's where the challenge comes in this sort of like, it's great to start thinking about where things are going to go because behind all of those decisions are the different IAM controls that are controlling the access to each of those individual bits of information to say, okay, yes, you are allowed to say, Earl Grey tea hot, right, into the computer and have the replicator spit it out. Maybe it's because it's my voice print or my biometric that's knowing who I am. I don't have to say I'm Captain Jean-Luc Picard. I am authorized to have Earl Grey tea. Make it now, right, or anything like that. It just knows who I am. It's maybe a presence sensor, but all this is data, right, flying behind the scenes. And we talk about how do you leverage that data to be able to make decisions on it. The policy construction has to be rock solid. You can't have tinkering of third parties coming in and changing policies, especially if we start to look at life and death decisions around, this is the real world. I think about, automated driving. At some point, someone is going to have to think about the scenario where I'm going to crash into a pole if I keep going. If I turn right, I'm going to hit the baby in the carriage. If I turn left, I'm going to hit a kid on a bicycle. How are you supposed to teach AI those types of scenarios? And what happens if someone starts to tinker with the attributes that control those scenarios and those variables that go into the calculation and say, okay, well, we think you have an 87% chance of survival if you hit the tree in front of you because of all the other safety mechanisms versus potentially, having other serious ramifications to the left or the right of you. So this is all data that flies behind the scenes. It's real time. It's split second. And any change in the access to any of those variables can have catastrophic, consequences.
I really like how you frame that. I think the thing I notice is the simplicity with which you described how the world is evolving. That it really is just one endpoint talking to another endpoint. And the thing that we're trying to understand is how do we assign identities to the endpoints? How do we say this endpoint should be able to talk to this endpoint, right? That's the problem that we're trying to solve. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that putting in a strong identity access management solution into a system before it evolves into something super complicated will help save money in the long run. And I think that is a very serious thing for people to consider is how much money do we really want to spend on the solution? Because people cost money, machines cost money, reworking costs money. All those things are very expensive. And I think you brought up really good points. Not even, I haven't even touched on all of the potential, consequences of machines talking to machines, but just getting that basic concept down of this thing can talk to this thing because it has access. And I don't know, Jim, what are your thoughts on ABAC for the scenario that Jeff described there?
Yeah, I was actually sitting here thinking, this is a fun conversation. We're really, thinking about the future, and heck, I mean, Jeff brought up the Star Trek Next Generation scenario, and so that really got me thinking. I mean, you can guarantee that 50 years from now, people are going to look back at us and think we were like cavemen. I mean, just think when I mean, I was around working on your Y2K issues and literally thinking to myself, like, why were they so lazy that they only stored 2-digit years, right? I mean, like, but that was the constraint they had at the time. It's easy to sit there in the future and look back and just, shake your head, but guarantee people will look back at this time and think, oh my gosh, they were cavemen.
I think about when I still see, oh, we use 8-character usernames because our systems can't support that. It's like, okay, that was a decision someone made like 30 years ago in like a mainframe or something, and they only coded a certain amount of memory for that. So, yeah, I mean, I think we certainly waxed poetic and philosophical today.
Yes, definitely went down the philosophical route. Yeah, yes, for sure. We definitely did.
To talk about, some of the ways that the semantic web maybe affects the IAM space. I think you're coming up on time here, and I want to be respectful of your time, Evan. I certainly appreciate you, taking the opportunity to kind of jump on with us and talk through some of these scenarios. Before we wrap things up for this episode, are there any kind of final words of wisdoms or deep thoughts that you want to leave for us?
I'm curious. What's your hacking story, Jeff?
Oh, well, my hacking story, it's definitely not as cool as yours. It was basically just figuring out the math. All right, so here's how old I am. I used to play EverQuest, the original one, OG EverQuest. And I figured out that if you ran at an angle, meaning the up arrow key and the left arrow key or right arrow key at the same time, your movement speed was actually faster than just going straight forward or straight back or straight left, right. So I use that to my advantage to be able to what we call kite monsters in the world so that I could do damage to them and they couldn't do damage to me. And I was killing stuff that was way, 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 way higher level than I was supposed to be able to do. Nice. So that's my, I guess that's my earliest hacking story that I can remember was cheesing in, EverQuest 1 with my bard out in, where was it? I guess it would have been Western Karana for all you EverQuest fans out there. So that's also a big sign of how much of a big dork on the video games that I can be sometimes.
You gotta live for the cheese, man. You gotta live for the cheese.
Yep. Jim, any final words you want to throw out there for the audience?
Well, I was just thinking as you were talking about the IoT and as it evolves, and we may not know all the answers, but I think that's why we bring on, guests like Evan onto the show to kind of fill in those gaps for us, right? We definitely don't know everything, but hopefully we can bring people onto the show who do know more than us and can help educate our audience. And I guess I do a call out to, Evan was a listener, and that was kind of how he found us. I put a call out there to our other listeners. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, you got some topic that you feel like you have enough expertise on to help kind of educate the listener base, the IAM practitioners of the world, reach out by LinkedIn. You can connect to Jeff and myself on LinkedIn. We're both pretty active. Evan, you're on LinkedIn as well. I'm sure you're open to connection requests as well.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I'm super grateful for you guys having me on the show. It has been a pleasure. You guys are hilarious. And I just love the conversation and the community that you guys are driving here. It's awesome.
Well, Identity Talk is just laugh a minute. It's super entertaining. So we try to take that spin as much as we can. I think that's a pretty good spot that we could probably leave things for this week. Evan, really appreciate your time. Thanks for listening in the first place. Thanks for being on the show as well and contributing, to this great experiment that we're doing in this wonderful world of podcasting. Jim, as always, appreciate your insights. And I think with that, we'll go ahead and wrap it up for this week. You can visit the show at identityatthecenter.com. You can follow us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. And as Jim mentioned, we're all on LinkedIn, and we'll have links in the show notes. You can connect with us there as well. But yeah, don't hesitate to reach out. We're always happy to talk IAM or really anything and just have a conversation about it and see where it takes us. So with that, we'll go ahead and leave it. Appreciate everyone for listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one. Thanks. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.